Hi, my name is Anna, but you can call me Anci. I'm your host, and welcome to the Binge on Self-Love podcast. I hope you are all doing really well. And if you're listening to this episode on YouTube, then hey, nice to meet you. This is my first video of me recording this podcast. And that's because today's episode is really special. Today, I had a chance to chat with Katherine Metzelaar, registered dietitian nutritionist and certified intuitive eating counselor. We've covered a lot of topics from Katherine's journey to becoming a nutritionist, helping people find freedom with food, through the differences between an eating disorder and disordered eating, and how to deal with comments people can make about our eating, to how to make building a healthier body image a priority, not just in 2024. I hope you will enjoy this episode, and now let's get into the interview. Okay, today I am joined by a very special guest, Katherine Metzelaar. Katherine is a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified intuitive eating counselor, and a founder and CEO of Brave Space Nutrition. Katherine and her team provide weight inclusive nutrition counseling to people who want to recover from an eating disorder, disordered eating, dieting, and who want to heal their body image. Katherine, thank you so much for taking your time for being here with me today. And welcome to the Binge on Self-Love podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. What a wonderful introduction. And yeah, I'm excited to dive into things with you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you are here, and I have so many questions. But first, I would like to start by learning a little bit about your journey. What led you to becoming a dietitian, helping so many people find peace with food and with their bodies?
Yeah. So I like to say that I grew up with a pretty food positive household. My mom was really trying her best to expose me to lots of different kinds of foods. There weren't really any food rules growing up in my house. Of course, there was, there's mealtime, there's snack time, but generally speaking, she tried not to demonize foods only because she was put on a diet at a really young age. And so she knew just intuitively that she wanted to do things differently. But I don't think that she read any books or had access to any information. She was just, trying to figure it out as she went along. And also, too, I played sports. So interestingly, my sports teams were also very food positive. They really encouraged eating and fueling for, practice and games and things like that. And so, in certain ways, I felt like I was protected from a lot of things that might have made me more vulnerable at a much younger age. We know, for example, when someone is exposed to diets and rules at a young age, then they're much more vulnerable, for example, to developing an eating disorder or disordered eating. So, what happened then? What is my long winding path? So I went off to college and my body changed, which is very common when we go to college. We're also still growing as well. And what did I do? What was my first go to when my body changed, when I had gained some weight? It was to go on a diet. And why did I go on a diet? Because despite my mom trying her best to create a household, create a food environment that was much different than hers, she was always dieting. Always. I don't remember a time in my life where she wasn't. She always, I also don't remember a time in which she felt good about her body. She would often avoid photographs. In fact, I don't have many photos of her as a result. And so I just did what all the women, and by the way, all the women in my family also dieted, all of her sisters, and they would stand around and talk about it at our family gatherings. And my aunt, which is an important side note, had bulimia, but was never officially diagnosed and was never treated either. It was sort of like this thing that the family whispered about. So, anyway, long story short, I went on a diet and that's when everything started to kind of go downhill for me. So I went on a diet that was very restrictive of carbohydrates, and that lasted for a certain amount of time, but was completely unsustainable. Then I started binging. Then I experienced purging for a little bit. And then I just started the disordered eating, dieting cycle where I would lose some weight, then I'd gain some weight, then I'd binge eat. And it was just this up and down and up and down and up and down. And then fast forward to I started becoming a vegetarian in college and started to get quite a bit of attention for that. People were really interested in it and they're like, wow, you're being so healthy. And I was like, ooh, this feels so good. So that people are so impressed by my food choices. And I see that too as a marker of the beginning of sort of the second phase, if you will, of my eating disorder, which was that became more and more restrictive. So, what started off as I don't want to eat meat because I don't love the process of killing animals, to oh, I learned about this online, and oh, I learned about that online, and oh, they said I should cut out this. And little by little, I got more and more restrictive with the sort of fear of anything quote unquote toxic coming into my body being the main drive for my choices. So I was in this place where everyone would come to me for advice. They'd be like, should I add this in? Should I take this supplement? And granted, this was before I went and got my master's of science in nutrition, before I became a dietitian. And so, because food consumed all of my time, because all I did is talk about food, think about food, read about food, buy cookbooks all day, all the time, I thought, well, I should just get my master's. I just need to get like a stamp of approval so that I could teach people to do exactly what I'm doing because I know all the answers, obviously, because Google is gospel and everything I read on Google. If someone said that research supported it, then of course it was true. So I went and got my master's, but while I was there, that's when everything kind of came unraveled, if you will, not all at once because it took some time, but it was the first time that I was challenged in my ways of thinking, because hopefully that happens in all education systems, but especially in graduate school, where I had to learn how to actually read research. So if someone said research supports it, they'd say, great, show me the study. Let me know what happened. Present your argument for, whatever it showed. And I started to realize that there's really terrible research. I mean, it seems obvious now, but I didn't know it at the time. There's so much that I didn't know. And I started to learn the value of all different kinds of foods in ways that I hadn't on Google. And this is like I mean, Facebook was around, but it was pre TikTok. I don't even know, maybe Instagram was just coming out. But you can imagine that like most of my information was from Google. So
Hmm.
I can only imagine how much faster it could happen now on social media because of that algorithm. But nonetheless, in graduate school, everything was challenged. I realized there was actually a guest speaker that came to talk about eating disorders, and she talked about a specific eating disorder called orthorexia. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is me. And orthorexia, for your folks that are listening, it is a subset of anorexia, kind of an offshoot of anorexia, which is that the priority for those that have orthorexia is kind of maintaining this quote unquote clean vessel, not putting anything quote unquote toxic into the body. And fear is really the driver around chemicals, around quote unquote toxic things. It's some people describe it as like an over obsession with healthy foods and healthy things. So I went to counseling and I started getting support and help around my relationship with food and my eating disorder, which, by the way, I never received a diagnosis. It's just because I specialize in eating disorders now. I'm able to look back and say, oh, yeah, this was happening at this time. This was happening at this time. And so I always like to share that because I really want people to know that even if they haven't received eating disorder diagnoses, that they still deserve help and support. So I got help and support. I finished my master's. I did my internship as a dietitian. And I decided that I didn't want people to suffer in the way that I had, that ideally I would be able to prevent people from spiraling into a place. Maybe I could catch them a little bit sooner, or I could help them in ways that I didn't know was available, help them in ways that I wanted to, ways in which it kind of lit me up to work with people. I first worked for a health company right out of grad school, and I'm really grateful for that opportunity. But I ended up leaving the company to start my business, Brave Space Nutrition, because there was an expectation for me to counsel around weight loss. And I just realized that if I couldn't practice in this way, in the way that I am now, then I didn't want to become, I didn't want to be a dietitian rather. And so it just became unethical to me after a certain point. Um, but yeah, all of that to say, it was largely my own um, relationship with food growing up, the things that I was exposed to, then how that spiraled into dieting that led to disordered eating and my own eating disorder, and then all of it falling apart in graduate school, and then deciding that I wanted to specialize in this particular area.
Hmm. Thank you so much, Catherine, for sharing your story. It's amazing to hear that you went through something that so many people also struggle with, and you were able to get to the other side now, helping people to gain the freedom with their body image and with food. That's really amazing to hear. And when you were mentioning your childhood and remembering your mom was really trying to build healthier eating habits for you, but somehow she couldn't find those or couldn't build those healthy habits herself. Do you think, or what do you think we should do as, I don't have a kid yet, but hopefully one day, what we should do as parents or future parents not to pass our negative relationship with food onto our children?
The first thing that I will offer is, I say this all the time to parents. One of the most helpful things that you can do as a parent in order to not pass um, our own food beliefs, our own relationship with food, diet culture beliefs, wellness culture beliefs, is to start with working on your own relationship with food. That's a very important part. Why do I say this? Because so many, couple reasons. One, so many of the teens that I worked with over time, when we start looking at what are the things that are impacting them, we first go into the family system, what's happening in the household, because we know that that has a huge impact, often much greater than what's happening out in the world, although that has an impact too, right? We can talk about that, but we have to address what's going on in the home. And while I know parents are trying the best that they can, they don't do it intentionally. So much of it is rooted in love, because maybe it's based on an experience that they had. Maybe they're worried about their kid. Maybe they've been told by their doctor XYZ about what they should cut out, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important that they heal as best as they can. They can be in the process. We don't have to already have been healed by the time we start having kids. But nonetheless, working and healing our own relationship with food in our body is a really beautiful place to start. And understanding the ways in which diet and wellness culture show up. It is so sneaky. It's so sneaky and so insidious. I often say, when we start to learn about it, it's like this whole other world that we didn't know existed. It's like we exist in this world, and then all of a sudden we're like, what? And it's like this invisible world, something out of like a sci-fi movie, right? You're like, oh my gosh, it's been right next to me and I couldn't see it. This is crazy. So, we wake up to the fact that we have been existing in diet and wellness culture. And as adults, we have to go through a process of understanding the ways in which it has impacted us, our food beliefs, our relationship with food, our relationship with our body, and start to challenge them over time, or else we run the risk of passing them on to our kids. And it's not intentional. I say this, for example, parents can be trying their best. And this is a great example is what happened with my mom growing up. Parents can be trying their best, and they're serving their kids the food. They're like, yes, I'm going to add in the carbohydrates and I'm not going to, restrict my children. And then what does, for example, let's say mom do? Mom has the meat and the vegetables and says, okay, well, the kid won't notice. The kid always notices. It's not always just about what you say. It's also about what you're doing. So one, work on your relationship with food in your body, whether that's seeking out one-on-one counseling, whether that's joining a group. There's a lot of really great mom groups where they are working on collectively healing their relationship with food in their body. And also reading some books, listening to some podcasts, educating oneself on how to feed the young child, because there's a lot of information out there, and understanding it's not easy to feed kids. And They, can be picky and they only want certain foods. And we worry that they're going to eat too much sugar. That's a common thing that comes up with parents. And so learning how to navigate that, knowing that your kids are going to be okay if they eat sugar, that what's most important is consistency and adequacy, and that kids get to decide what they eat. I could go on for a long time about feeding the young child if you can't tell. But I think if I had to choose one, it would be starting with oneself, working on your relationship with food in your body, because they will see things, they will pick up on things, and you get to implement the things that you're learning along the way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It makes a lot of sense because I was thinking that oftentimes the parents try to say one thing, but they do the other thing. And when you see your mom eating every time for example, my mom would always eat a salad for lunch and she would never have the same lunch that we did. And she was always looking for magazines and TV shows where they would recommend how to lose weight. And even though she didn't try to put that on me, obviously it passed on me. So I think that the action is obviously louder than the words or what she
Yeah,
says or the
absolutely.
parents say.
Yeah, we talk a lot about modeling. What are parents modeling for their children? And while parents aren't intending this and they are trying their best, I like to emphasize that because
Yeah.
um, I want there to be some compassion that I send towards parents, because they don't often know or they're not sure. And I also say to the individuals that I work with that have experienced harm in the hands of their parents, that intent doesn't negate impact. That while their parents were trying their best, it's still their behavior still caused harm in the long run. But you're absolutely right. What our parents are modeling, we are seeing and picking up on, and especially for women with our moms or girls, they're noticing things.
Yeah. One more thing that I wanted to touch on when you were sharing your story was disordered eating versus eating disorder. Maybe could you explain that a little bit to the listener? Because I often feel like that a lot of people feel like they have a problem, but they don't have enough problem to ask for help or ask for support. So maybe if you could explain that a little bit.
I believe that if there's chaos in the brain, you deserve help. Full stop. If there is chaos about food, if there is chaos about your body, then there should be no questions asked that you deserve help. And also, what I encourage people to do, and I'm going to answer your question in just a moment, what's the difference between disordered eating and eating disorder? What I encourage people to do, though, is if you're wondering, reach out to any of the clinicians to have a discovery call, to ask these kind of questions, to talk about what you're going through, and we will give you an honest answer. I would say that 100% of the people that I talk to are candidates for nutrition counseling. I have yet to have talked to someone and said, I don't think that you are a good candidate. Now, I will say, as an aside, a couple of times if they're looking for weight loss counseling, that I'm not the best fit. But nonetheless, going back to what you were saying, difference between disordered eating and eating disorders. So the way I like to describe it, I have a wonderful blog that I wrote that I can also share with you and your audience. But it's really about a spectrum. So if we think about the spectrum as disordered eating being on one side, or maybe normative eating on one side and eating disorders on the other, disordered eating is kind of in between. So it's that eating disorders receive, those individuals that have eating disorders receive a diagnosis because they fit specific criteria. And what's that criteria? We use the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, where there's specific descriptions for each eating disorder that say, a person has experienced X number of symptoms in X amount of time. And we go through that and kind of check the criteria. And if someone meets all of those, then they receive official diagnoses. But what happens when someone doesn't check all those boxes? What if, for example, someone is not purging once weekly? What if they're purging once a month, or some months they're purging twice a month, right? Or what if someone is binge eating, but they're not binge eating 3 times a week? They're binge eating once a week. So this is when we start to move along the spectrum. So we go from eating disorders into what some people call subclinical eating disorders, and we're kind of entering into, again, on the spectrum, disordered eating, which is there's a collection of different kinds of disordered behaviors that are happening, but they don't fit into a box. There's not a frequency that meets the criteria for an eating disorder diagnosis. Everyone on this spectrum is deserving of help and support. So we're just talking about a change in frequency of behaviors as we're moving throughout. Also, too, it's important to note that those with eating disorders, it is a mental health diagnosis. They are mental illnesses in comparison to as we move through the spectrum. There are some differences that we see with disordered eating versus an eating disorder diagnosis. But in comparison, we're still talking about it taking up a lot of headspace. We're still talking about it stealing life from you. We're still talking about it occupying your waking moments of this precious life that you have. And we're still talking about dysfunction as a common theme throughout this whole spectrum as it relates to food and one's body. So it's really about frequency and also severity of what is going on. And that's what we're looking at on this spectrum. So anyone on this spectrum is deserving of help and support. It just means that folks somewhere in the middle on the disordered eating spectrum might not meet that criteria for an eating disorder. And that's okay. It doesn't mean anything besides they don't fit that specific criteria. And maybe there's just less frequency of the disordered behaviors. Or maybe the intensity of their relationship with their body or their hatred or disgust of their body is maybe a little less, but we're still talking about it being um, enough to have the person suffering.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so happy that you mentioned that everyone on the spectrum deserves to get support and get help, because I feel like people often feel like they are not sick enough or they don't have enough problem to
Mhm.
ask for that help. So I'm
Mhm.
really grateful that you mentioned that.
Yeah. I mean, we see it with people that are really, really sick. That belief doesn't go away.
Yeah.
I have seen it with the most unwell people that I have worked with, this feeling that they're not sick enough to get
Hmm.
help and support. And I think part of it is the way that eating disorders and disordered eating shows up. But
Hmm.
part of it too is how much our culture normalizes all of the behaviors that show up with disordered eating and eating disorders. Dieting is a disordered behavior. And so, of course, why would we think, oh, I think I need help when everything culturally around us is saying, you're doing great. Good job.
Hmm.
Just diet harder, just cut out more foods. And so it leaves us feeling like we're, one, quite alone and feeling like there must be something wrong with me because this is what I'm supposed to be doing and everybody else is doing it. And so I think that's part of it too, this feeling like, well, it's not as bad as what I've seen on TV, which, by the way, is not helpful because a lot of what we see as a representation of eating disorders is not really an accurate representation of how eating disorders truly um, manifest.
And as you've mentioned, the diets being normalized in our society, this kind of leads me to my next question that I wanted to ask. That we are now recording this episode at the end of the holiday season, which for a lot of people can be triggering, challenging, and stressful regarding food and eating in front of a large group of people, eating foods that they don't often eat or they don't usually eat. And we're entering the new year, which for many people is triggering in terms of weight loss and setting goals like going to the gym more, losing weight, or building muscles and stuff like that. What would you think, or what would you recommend to people to don't follow this kind of like this, not trend, but like this way, but maintain like a healthier body image and healthier relationship with themselves?
The holiday times tend to be a particularly difficult time for people. Every year, for this reason, I have a free anti-diet holiday challenge because of this, because we're surrounded by family and we hopefully love our family, but they can be really challenging. There's often foods, as you mentioned, that we are exposed to. Um, and there might be certain foods too that we only get one time a year. So we might notice having more of them. And then usually what happens, here's the classic scenario. We're dieting and restricting, whether it's a specific, diet or just cutting back on certain foods or eating in a certain way. We go into the holidays and there's all this amazing food and we're on vacation and we're relaxing and we're exposed to the food and we've been restricting it. So we might notice eating a little bit more. Maybe we binge on some of those foods. We feel guilty. Maybe we stop going to the gym as much, and then we feel like our body has changed. And it might change some, especially if we're going from restriction into the holidays. And then what happens? The diet and wellness industry comes January 1st and is so ready for
Yes.
everybody. It primes us, to sell their products to us. We're vulnerable. We're told all kinds of things during the holidays. And then in the new year, they're like, great, look, here's the solution. Here's how you are going to complete your New Year's resolutions. All the things that you want are in this program, and here's how we're going to help you. So, I think the first thing, if someone is wanting to heal their relationship with food in their body and or they're on their own journey of healing, is to first and foremost realize and just take a moment to honor your own vulnerability. In what ways are you vulnerable to these kinds of messages? And where will you likely be getting them from? Because that's an important part of sort of preemptively protecting ourselves from some of those messages. Now, we can't protect ourselves from everything. Because if we go to, for example, movement classes, say we go to like a spin class or a yoga class, we can control what people are saying. There's going to be people around us that are going to be engaging in diets, resolutions, things like that. So if we're wanting to try to move away from that, we have to honor some of our vulnerability. We have to honor that we might be exposed to more of these conversations than we would be throughout the year. And therefore, we need to set ourselves up in advance as best as we can to figure out what we're going to do when that happens. I'm a huge fan of something called front loading, which is, this can show up in a couple different ways. But one is planning for in advance ways that we're going to support ourselves when things come up. So, for example, if we know that at a certain workout class, they're probably going to talk about burning calories and New Year's resolutions and things like that, what are we going to do? What are we going to do before we go to that class, during that class, after that class? Do we need to recruit a buddy, for example, that we're going to text and call and say, hey, I'm going to need some support after this because it's going to be hard to get through this class? Do we need to make sure that we've got food ready and snacks ready because we know that the disordered eating voice is going to show up because there is that talk, and make sure that we're eating anyway, even though that voice is probably going to say, you should probably just skip eating after you worked out, or, you don't really need to eat today. So, and the reason why I'm offering this is because oftentimes something happens, there is some kind of stimulus, something that maybe colludes with the eating disorder or disordered eating. And then it's what happens afterwards that usually impacts us. It spirals into something else. Oh, they talked about burning calories. Well, I probably shouldn't be eating this. And that turns into something else, which turns to something else. And we're trying to work on breaking that, what sometimes I call like a tumbleweed or a vortex that we get kind of stuck in. Um, so, acknowledging our own vulnerabilities, setting ourselves up as best as we can in advance, and taking some time, if you can, to connect to and understand what your values are and what you personally want out of 2024. I really like to do this practice of intention setting in the new year, of not resolutions. I'm not a huge fan of that, but just what is important to me, what matters. And if someone, and I'm assuming your audience, if they're listening to this, if it's important that they no longer spend their life filled with dieting and restriction and body hatred, then it's helpful to have that be the anchor as they enter into the new year, so that when there's temptation, for example, to maybe try something that your friends are trying, to remind yourself that you are doing it differently in 2024 and the reasons why, kind of coming back to your values. Because I want to live a life with presence, because family is important to me. And I realize when I'm stuck in thinking about food in this way, it takes away from that. And the last thing that I'll say is that community is important. Community is very important because this work can be very lonely. And also, if you are, this is very common, if you're surrounded by people that are engaging in dieting and restriction and over exercise and are still stuck in diet and wellness culture, that's okay. We can still love them, but we have to also find a community of people. There's Facebook groups, there's programs, different things that people can join. Even listening to a podcast, I think, is a way that we can also connect to community like yours. um, Connecting to community will be essential because it often feels like in doing this work, or at least my clients have described it this way, is like you're swimming upstream for a
Hmm.
while. Like it's a lot of work. And when you have people alongside of you, it makes a huge difference, especially during like the New Year time, coming out of the holidays, entering into this, what I consider just a really vulnerable time for people. So we want to be extra sensitive with ourselves, extra supportive for ourselves as best as we can.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, especially the community. I agree with that. And but sometimes I feel like community or like social media have like two sides. Sometimes they can that's a great space where we can find support and people going through the same things, but the other times, sometimes when we're trying to build a healthier relationship with food and with ourselves, there's tons of people who share like unhealthy diets and quick weight loss and everything. And sometimes we kind of look up to those people or look up to them as sources of information, as you mentioned earlier that in your earlier years you were using Google as a source of information for everything. And now I feel like a lot of people reach out to social media to get the information how to, I don't know, how to lose weight or these like all of these goals. Have you find like any balance or way how not to let these people or these diets and stuff like that affect us when we are on social media?
Social media is such an interesting world, right? Um, we need to be cautious about who we're following as best as we can. Um, to your point, we can get so much rich information, especially as we're beginning our journey or just in thinking about, as we were talking about, finding community, connecting to people that are either dietitians like myself who are sharing information, other people that are on their own journeys. And there's a couple things. One, there's the toxic folks that are on social media that are going to be talking about things that you were trying to move away from. So we need to unfollow them. We need to, and if we're not ready to unfollow them, you can mute them. You can this is something else I recommend, put their name in your notes app on your phone and then unfollow them. If you want to come back to them, you can, but give yourself a couple of months and just go back to that list. It is okay to unfollow people. Please unfollow. Use that button as much as you can. The next thing is, I think that we all need to limit. I know it's easier said than done. I am working on it personally, but we need to limit our social media time. It is not helping most of us for a whole host of reasons. And I think that there are all kinds of really beautiful ways to learn and find community that don't require that we be on social media. And I'll add that oftentimes, and I see this with my clients, and I know this generally, specializing in eating disorders and disordered eating, that while it can be helpful to see people that are on a similar journey to you, for example, let's say someone is wanting to develop an intuitive eating relationship with food, or people show like my journey to from the eating disorder to recovered. There are certain elements in certain ways that can be helpful, but sometimes it ends up not being helpful and it does the opposite. Because what happens? We start comparing our journey to their journey. We start comparing our body to their body. We start comparing how they're eating in certain ways to how we're. And it just scrambles everything and tends not to generally be as helpful as we think it might be. So I would say media literacy is important. There's also just, oh, there's so much mis and disinformation on social media. There's no fact checking. So people will say all kinds of things. So I often say that a good guide for social media is like if it is related to food and it is causing you anxiety, like if it's fear inducing, if it's very sensationalist, like you'll never believe that X, or like, did you know that blah, blah, blah is killing you? I don't know. It's just so, this huge statement. I've heard it all on social media. It probably is inaccurate, and or they're taking something that they may have heard and turning it into something that isn't substantiated. So I guess all that to say is that we want to be really cautious when we're on our own healing journey when it comes to food and our relationship with our body. Unfollow people, follow new people, right? Look up hashtags, look up, we got to be careful because the algorithm picks up on things so quickly. And then before you know it, you're just like you're being fed all kinds of stuff. Um, and diversify the ways in which you're getting information. If social media is a place you like to hang out, great. Try to change some of the people that you're following and unfollow people that just aren't helpful. If you're realizing that following someone every time you see them and you get off and you realize you start criticizing your face or your body, probably not the best person to follow. And look, they might be talking about ways to do your hair. I don't know. They could be talking about anything, but if the impact on you is that you leave feeling worse than you did coming into it, unfollow. Then think about diversifying where you get your information. Maybe do a little bit of social media, you limit it. Then you listen to your podcast, and then you read a book, and then you check out an article. That there's many different places that we can learn from as we're on this journey that don't require that we stay on social media all the time. And I would say I would recommend not getting all of the information off of social media.
Yes, yes, I totally agree with that. One thing that I wanted to also ask was um, oftentimes when we are maybe trying to change something in our life, we're trying to maybe incorporate more foods into the way we are eating or change our habits. And we live with someone, whether that's our family, friends, our spouse, or whoever, we can get comments from those people surrounding the portion size or the foods we eat. Do you have any tips how to deal with those types of comments without kind of like letting those comments get too much into our minds? If that makes
It's
sense.
Yeah, it's really challenging depending on who's saying the comments. So you're talking about partners, you're talking about family, and I think those comments can be particularly tricky for a couple of reasons. And when I say tricky, I mean in comparison to strangers. Because oftentimes when I talk to folks, they'll say, if I was out in public and someone was like, do you really need that second helping? They would feel usually, not always, but usually a lot more freedom to say, who are you talking to? Right. Or they might say something of like, yeah, I do want a second portion. What are you know, there'd be a little bit more indignation, but when it comes to family and partnerships and people that we want to maintain relationships with, it gets much more challenging. One, because it tends to be more hurtful from coming from the people that we love. Two, because it's much more challenging to set boundaries with people where there's more risk, which tends to be people that we have um, closer relationships to, because the risk is, or often the fear is that the relationship will rupture, right? The relationship will change if we were to set a boundary and say something or ask for something. So I first want to acknowledge that it is challenging. Those situations are tough, they can be hurtful, and they can impact us for some time. I'm seeing this, or I often see this at this time of year with my clients. They go home and they come out, and it's like we've been working on something for many months, and then it just unravels because some dad says like, Do you really want that second helping? I think you've had enough. And then we have to work for months to try to get back to where we are. So, what then do we do? What do we do when our family is making comments? We've got a couple different options. One is that the first thing, and I would say before we jump into what can you do, the first thing that I teach my clients to do is understand what happens for them when someone makes a comment. What happens internally? So, what's our response? What do we notice in physical sensations and thoughts, in emotions? And then what then can it lead to afterwards? We have to understand some of that because we have to know how we're going to take care of ourselves when someone makes a comment. That's an important part that we'll come back to in a moment. So, first, understand how we respond. And what I mean by that, do we tense up and turn inward and kind of shut down? Or do we get really angry and hot and really want to say something, but we don't? Do we explode? Is that kind of our response? Do we get completely numb and disconnect and then notice like not really feeling hungry, right? We want to get curious about our response or reaction to these comments. The next thing in moving into options is there's a couple different directions we can go in. One is that we can go with the more what I call playful way of approaching it, which is where we can say a common statement that I often offer to adults that we say to kids, but I think it's a helpful line is don't yuck my yum. Don't say something is yucky to something that I think is yummy, right? So we can be playful and have statements like that if, mom is saying like, "Oh, do you really need that second plate?" or you've had enough. Just mom, don't yuck my yum. Pay attention to your plate, not mine, right? There's a playful nature that some people like or prefer, or like, yeah, I want a second plate. Yeah, I'm still hungry. So there's that direction we can go in, the playful direction. We can go in the other direction of, and I'm going to go in the scale of often what feels harder for people. So that one usually feels pretty approachable. The next one is not saying anything. So this could feel sometimes a little bit awkward, but I really like to give people permission to not respond. And of course, it depends on what the person is saying and if they're asking a question. But you can and have permission if someone says, "Wow, that's a lot of food," for you to say or respond with, little it can be a little awkward, but you have no responsibility to
Mm.
respond to them, right? You can nod, right? Or if you don't want to smile, you don't have to smile, right? There aren't any rules here. The next one is that you can say something, and there's a couple different ways that you can say something that's a little bit more straightforward. um, you can say, "Please don't make comments about what I'm putting on my plate. That isn't super helpful." Or "Mind your plate and not mine." That one's a little bit more playful. Um, and I think, too, one thing I forgot to mention is this is another area of front loading that can be helpful if our family is open to receiving it, or we think that we might. Some families are very toxic, and what I'm about to say, won't work. But if they're open to having a conversation before the holidays start, what I often recommend to my clients is saying, "Hey, parents, hey, family, um, maybe you haven't talked to them about the work that you're doing. Say, I'm working on healing my relationship to food and my body." One of the things I've realized is that when people make comments about what I'm eating, what I put on my plate, or if I take seconds, it tends to really be not helpful for me. And so I'm wondering if this year we could work on not saying that. And I'm trying to work on not saying that for other people too, even though we are not doing it. This is just part of the uh, activity, if you will. I'm trying to work on not saying it too. And so I'm wondering if we could hold each other accountable. So if you could not say it, and if you notice me saying it, if you could notice, catch me if I'm saying it. So this way it feels like a team effort, like we're both working to pay attention to whether or not we're saying it. And then come up with a way, because here's what happens. We say this, and then inevitably someone says something. We work up the courage to say, "Hey, could you please not make comments this year around food?" And then mom's like, "Do you really need that second serving?" And it's like, oh, It's so painful because you've worked so hard to try to talk about the things that you need. And usually it's not intentional, it's just because it's new. It takes a while for us to learn new things. So it's important that people, when they're having the conversation, to say, okay, when it does come up, might not, but when it does come up, how do we want to navigate it? Is it okay if I just say, Mom, remember we said we're not going to talk about that? Or, hey, I just like lift up a finger. You communicate in advance how you're going to navigate it when it does happen, because it will happen inevitably. So, front loading is important, that you have permission to say something or not say something in those moments, to come up with a few things that you might want to say. This can be helpful in particular for folks that maybe, this is very common for folks that I work with, maybe they're people pleasing, maybe they haven't necessarily had a voice in their life, or feel afraid of standing up for themselves or setting a boundary. It's helpful to practice. It can feel really weird, but I tell my clients to practice in the mirror, practice walking around, of like, hey, please don't say that about my food, or whatever it might be, right? Come up with a couple of things, because often too, some of the awkwardness around saying it is because we're just not used to saying it. We're just not used to having um, those words in that order come out of our mouth. And so practicing saying what we'd like to say can also be helpful, and reminding ourselves that boundaries can look like all different kinds of things. We can say something, we cannot say something. And also, a boundary is removing yourself. So you don't have to stay. One of the beautiful things about being an adult is, now, I am, I think it would be really tough to just like leave a family gathering. You could, right? Just be like, I'm out of here. But remember that you can take breaks. If something in the moment, if you're thinking, wow, that was just really hard, and I'm really noticing now that I don't want to eat, you go to the bathroom or you go somewhere else. You say, hey, I got to go to the bathroom, and just find a room, or, um, and then take a moment. Take a moment. And this is also a really great time if you let a friend or a buddy know in advance that you might call or text them. This could be the moment to just say, like, oh, I'm having a hard moment, or cue up some music that you want to listen to in hard moments, or cue up a YouTube playlist of baby animals, something that's going to help you in the moment when you're activated, when your parent or someone in your family says something, so that you're not then, because usually what happens is parent says something, okay, I'm going to restrict my food intake, or I'm not going to eat, or I'm going to binge, or something else. Um, that removing yourself is also an option, to say, hey, I gotta run to the bathroom, take a couple breaths, reconnect to yourself, do some things that might feel soothing, and then come back to the meal. So there's a few options, and all of it takes practice, and it never goes exactly how we want it to go. There's no perfect way of doing it. Being a human and being in families is messy, and it's especially hard when we're on our own healing journey and our families are not. So it's not going to be the time that we're probably going to educate. It's not going to be the time that we're going to say, like, you know what, although this could happen, but like, you know what, Mom, you really need to read this book, or um, we're trying to sort of get through the holidays in certain ways. And with practice, it does all get a little bit easier. Um, but it can be tough with families.
Yes, yes. I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And I think that really sometimes it's about communicating with family or with whoever you are hanging out with, because they don't even realize that the comments that they make can be hurtful, or they can trigger you in any kind of way. So communicating, but of course, it obviously depends whether the family is kind of open to discussion or open to it. If not, then there's not much you can do to change their mindset. Great. I wanted to touch on a little bit about on the body image, because I believe for many people it can be kind of the goal that they set for, whether that's New Year or just in general, that that's something they would want to work on. Katherine, why do you think that the body image is so important, and why should we try to build a healthier one if we don't?
Our bodies are what carry us through the world, right? They are what a colleague of mine calls our skin suits. And when we are in disgust of our body, when we hate our body, it makes a lot of things in our life really difficult. And I often say that it's quite difficult to work on healing our relationship with food and just kind of leave the body out of it. That we have to also be working on and cultivating a different relationship with our body. And I say different intentionally, and I'm going to explain that in a second, than where we're at right now. Because they don't exist in silos, right? We can't separate our relationship with food with our relationship with our body. And having a hateful or dissatisfied relationship with our body impacts our life really significantly. It impacts how we move through the world. It impacts our joy, our pleasure. It impacts the things we go after or don't, jobs, vacations, life. I mean, and I say this because part of what drives me in this work is that I want people to live full, juicy, amazing, pleasurable lives and move in pursuit of and in the direction of the things that light them up the most. And oftentimes for people, what stops them is their relationship with food and their relationship with their body. And it steals life. It steals life from us. I can't tell you how many people that I've worked with, and I'll say this for myself too, when I look back and think, wow, I missed out on so much life because I was so stuck in not only disordered eating, but also just hatred of my body, thinking about it all the time. So um, it is important that we shift our relationship with our body so that we can live more full and meaningful lives. And what I meant when I said a different kind of relationship is there's often, and I hear this all the time, this felt sense of expectation that you need to love your body in order to change your relationship with your body. And that's just not true. Well, I want everyone to love their body. Wouldn't that be amazing? That would be so great. It is really difficult. And I talk about this in the body image group that I run for women. It's really difficult to go from hatred and disgust to love. That is a huge jump. So oftentimes we're working towards the things in the middle. So, what could body appreciation look like for you? What could body neutrality look like for you? Could we get to a place where you're okay with your body or it feels good enough so that you can do the things that you want to do, be present in the way that you want to be present, not have it occupy all of your headspace? There's other things that we can connect to and cultivate that don't require that you love your body in order to change your relationship with your body. And I think that's really important because I see this on social media and a lot of places. People feel like, well, I need to love my body. You're just going to tell me to say these positive mantras and make me love my body. And that is definitely not the case. I think that a lot of times, even the ways in which at least body positivity is portrayed um, can often mimic the same kinds of things that we're told from diet and wellness culture, even though I know that's not the intention of like, you got to love your body, do it this way. And it just ends up feeling like something else we're doing wrong. And instead, I encourage folks to connect to what their body can do for them instead of what our body looks like externally. You know, we are raised essentially from birth and taught that our outward appearance is the most important thing about us. And so therefore we end up seeing ourselves like an outsider looking in. It's what happens with something called self-objectification. So we no longer relate to our body from the inside. Wow, I appreciate my body for doing XYZ. Wow, I feel connected to it. To, oh, my body looks like this, or we'll be sitting there and catch ourselves and think, oh, you know, my thighs look this way, or my belly looks this way. So we're trained to really see our body as an object. And so part of what we're doing in doing body image healing work is training ourselves out of that to not think about and relate to our body as an object, but rather something that is carrying us through this life and try to connect to what it can do for us, what it can offer to us, what it allows us to feel, see, experience. And it takes time. And our relationship with our body changes, ebbs and flows. Also, too, because we age and our body's constantly changing. It's a myth that our body stays the same for the entirety of our lives. We see this a lot. I see this a lot with women. And of course, we feel this way because of all the messaging that we're exposed to around what our bodies are supposed to look like. But it can be a really painful process. There's a lot of things that our body has experienced. And as we begin to unpack and examine what's in there, we realize that there's been a lot of things that we have experienced that are really hard and that have likely contributed to how we are in relationship with our body. I also often say that our relationship with our body is just like any other relationship in our life. It's got ebbs and flows. Sometimes we're so mad at it, just like in our, relationships or our partnerships. Sometimes it's really, great or a little bit better. But that just like any relationship, we have to work on it. We have to cultivate it. We have to learn new skills. Sometimes things work, sometimes things don't work. And that is another relationship that we maintain for the entirety of our lives.
Yes, yes, I totally agree with that. That we often overlook how important that relationship with our bodies is, because that's the only relationship that we are guaranteed will last with us forever.
Yes,
Yeah,
I love that.
and as you've mentioned that we often find it difficult to accept that our bodies are changing, because every stage of our lives we are going through, our bodies are changing. Do you have any maybe tips or advice how to try to accept our body at every stage it is at currently?
The first thing that I think of is accepting and leaning into the fact that our body will continue to change. I know that sounds obvious, but I actually don't think that we feel that. Oftentimes, we become, as humans, attached to things generally, um, and expect that it won't change. We could apply this to so many things, right? But especially when it comes to our body, that we don't think that our body is going to change as we age. We might conceptually know that, but as it's happening, it can be surprising, it can be challenging, it can be frustrating. So the first thing is we want to acknowledge that it's going to happen. To absolutely start with so much compassion, so much compassion. And compassion, for folks that are listening, a lot of times if they don't practice it, isn't like you are great and this is, you're going to get through this and like you go. Those are great if those resonate, but that's not what compassion is. Compassion is an acknowledgement of essentially our own suffering in the moment, or another way to describe it is things that feel challenging and honoring that. This is really hard for me to see my body aging. This is really hard for me to not try to change my body shape and size as it's shifting and as I'm noticing. It's really hard for me, right? So we take some time to practice self compassion, to bring in some mindfulness, to acknowledge that we're not alone in our own suffering. And I think the other thing too is like we have to be thoughtful about who we surround ourselves with, both online and offline. So if we are only, because this is what happens culturally, we see the same shit over and over again. We see the same body type, we see the same generally younger person in ads and things like that. And so what happens to us? We start to feel like there's something wrong with us, and that's what we're supposed to look like. When in reality, that's not what the rest of the world looks like. There's diversity in race and age and body shape and size. So we want to curate our feed if we're on social media and pay attention to who we're surrounding ourselves in person, so that we can have people in our life that also have, maybe they don't have the same bodies, but they're experiencing similar things, or we can see that there's diversity. As we're aging, we can see other people around us bodies changing. We can see that not everybody looks like what we see on social media. We can see that it's normal to not have the body that we had in high school or in college when we're in our 50s and 60s, right? I think it's important that our brain, or I know it's important that our brain and our eyes see that we are not alone. This kind of comes back to the community piece of things, and see that there's nothing wrong with your body. There's nothing wrong with your body. It is simply just experiencing life. Aging is normal and natural, and also changing in shape and size. That we gain weight. If we're going to normalize losing weight, we also have to normalize gaining weight. And so, expect that your body will change, which doesn't make it any easier in the moment. Surround yourself with community. Pay attention to what you're exposing yourself to, and give yourself some grace and compassion that it can take some time to move into acceptance. You don't have to arrive there right away. It's okay to honor that things are hard and that you have this real desire to want to not be where you're at, and that it can take time to move into acceptance, which is, this is what's happening. And how can I navigate this moving forward? How can I support myself despite maybe not loving where I'm at or where my body is at or the way that it's changing?
Hmm. I think that the word compassion that you've mentioned is really, really important in terms of accepting where we are and what our body looks like. And what helped me personally, for example, was kind of focusing on health and what my body allows me to do, and not focus so much on what it looks like. But maybe I've gained weight from I don't know, from some years ago, but I'm happy, I'm healthy, I'm able to do so many things that I wasn't able to do before, and it kind of gives me the encouragement that I think I need. So, as you mentioned, compassion is really, really important in that.
Yeah, it really is.
And Catherine, do you think there, or what do you think? What are some things that you would like to see in 2024, and what are some things that you would like to disappear from 2024 when it comes to dieting, diet industry, food, social media, and this all these things that people share regarding food and stuff like that?
Oh my goodness, such a good question. Okay, what are some things that I want to go away, and what are some things, is that right? Is that the question? What
Yeah,
are some
yeah.
things?
What
Okay.
would you like to disappear and go away, and what would you like to see on the other hand?
What I would like to go away is people believing and advertising that they are experts around food when they have no training and no education around, experts on around food. And because I see this all the time, people are what we call armchair experts. So they read a couple of things. I mean, I was totally guilty of this in the past. So the call is coming from inside the house, but nonetheless, um, they get so many likes and so many views on these videos that are not actually rooted in truth and spread a lot of misinformation. So I wish that people took, nutrition as seriously as, say, like, you wouldn't take dentistry advice, I hope not, from someone who's not a dentist, or you wouldn't go to to get surgery from someone who's not a surgeon, right? So, um, I would like people that have no training, no education, no understanding of food, um, to stop making harmful statements online about extremes and absolutisms around food, and fear mongering people um, into 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 cutting out foods, into just being afraid of food generally. Um, and what I'd like to see more of in 2024 is less extremes, less polarizing of good and bad and healthy and not healthy, and realizing that health is complex, and we have been told that we have a lot more control over it than we actually do in many ways. This, I want people to be talking, here's the thing, I want people to be talking about social determinants of health a lot more than they do, which are all the things that contribute to our health and well-being, that have nothing to do with food and movement, that have the greatest impact on our overall health. Because, in our culture, and of course this shows up on social media too, in our culture, we really like to simplify things. Well, it's just the way you move, the exercise you do, and the way that you eat. And we forget that for a lot of people, there's a lot more, that we're all impacted by the social systems we exist in, by socioeconomics, by education, et cetera, et cetera. And this is especially, for example, in the US. And so I just want to be ideally more nuanced conversations. It was like social media is not a place for nuance. Um, but for us to really start questioning um, what we see, and for people to not be speaking in absolutes just out in the world, that either it's this or this. And yeah, and really tailoring health and well-being to the individual, rather than trying to say this is right for everyone in the way that I'm saying it.
Mhm. Yeah, great. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Catherine, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, for being able to talk to you, and for you sharing so many amazing advice and information to our listeners. I would like to ask you if anyone maybe now listening to this podcast wants to reach out to you, where they can reach out to you, where they can get in touch with you.
First, definitely on my website, Brave Space Nutrition, BRAVE space. So all one word, nutrition.com. Also, a really wonderful free resource, my weekly newsletter that I send out, called Dear Diet Culture, It's Me Sunday, where I send tips, I send advice, all about healing your relationship with food in your body. I also put blogs and videos and things that I think are helpful along the way. So those are two great places. Social media, Katherine Metzelaar, at Katherine Metzelaar on Instagram, at Katherine Metzelaar on TikTok, at Katherine Metzelaar on YouTube. And so, all places, if someone is wanting to learn more and connect with me, you can either reach out on the website, reach out or follow me on all of those places. Check out the blog too. Speaking of free resources, our blog has so many wonderful articles. If someone's like, I don't know where to start, or I want more information, those can all be really great places to begin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine, for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was such a pleasure to speak with you, and yeah, I'm excited for your audience to receive this episode.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in today and for listening to this interview. A huge thank you to Catherine for taking her time and chatting with me. You will find links to Catherine's website and social media in the show notes, so make sure to check them out. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to the Binge on Self Love podcast on any platform where you get your podcasts. And I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, take care and talk to you soon.